When you launch the Pool Doctors app, a gICAPI web component displays the splash screen. This video demonstrates how to implement a gICAPI web component by exploring the splash screen implementation. In the previous video, you learned to integrate a web component into the form using a special web component field. So let's start by taking a look at the form used for the splash screen. Splash.4fd. The form has one field on it, a web component widget with a component type property. The component type specifies the name of the web component interface script, programmable.html. The interface script is an HTML document that contains a JavaScript interface or a reference to an external JavaScript file. You must include the interface script in the deployment package along with any additional supporting files. You can set the FGL image path environment variable to the script location in development mode, and it will be automatically transferred to the front end. You control gICAPI web components on the front end through a gICAPI interface object defined in the interface script. gICAPI class methods manage communication between your BDL program and the web component, handle interaction events, the focus, and the value of the web component field. When it's time to display the splash screen, the BDL code calls this setById method and passes in an ID of root and some HTML to replace the inner HTML of the root element with the splash screen image. As you can see, the inner HTML is just an empty division with an ID of root that takes up the full height and width of the web component. Let's look at the details of how this is implemented. Main.4GL calls a function named execute in an external module splash before opening the first form. The module is imported with the import statement here at the top of main. If you open the splash module and take a look, you can see that the execute function opens a window with the splash form you saw earlier, calls a function named splash, and then closes the window again. The splash function uses a special front call method to call the setById function in the interface script, passing the literal root and the results of the function splash HTML as parameters. Remember that it knows the name of the interface script containing the setById function by the component type property set in the form. The splash HTML function returns HTML to specify the image and settings to be used for the splash screen display, which will take up the full height and width of the web component form field. Note that it will also attach an onClick method to the root element so that if a user taps within the web component, it will call the execAction function in the interface script and pass in the literal splash. Here is the execAction function in the interface script. When the onClick method calls this function and passes in the value splash, the action method raises or triggers the splash action. The second parameter isn't important for the splash screen implementation and is set to an empty value. The splash function follows the front call with a simple input statement and onAction blocks to handle user interaction. When the user taps the splash screen and triggers the splash action, the handler calls a function to open the first application form. Here is a sequence diagram to help clarify the steps you've seen. Main open first form calls the execute function in the module splash before the job header list form is displayed. In the Splash module, the Execute function opens a window with the Splash form and calls the Splash function. Splash uses a front call method to call the setById function in the interface script. It passes in HTML results from the Splash HTML function for the splash screen display. The HTML contains an on-click method to raise the splash action when the user taps within the web component. The interface script setById function uses the HTML passed in from Splash to replace the empty web component form field with the Pool Doctor's splash screen image. When the user taps the splash screen, the execAction function raises the splash action. The input statement in the Splash function contains an onAction block for the splash action that calls a function to open the job header list form, the first application form you see when you launch the Pool Doctors app. You can see from the splash screen example that working with gICAPI web components can get a bit complex. You can learn more about gICAPI web components and how to implement them in the Genero Mobile documentation.